Eileen Barker was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1938. After an early career in drama, she earned a baccalaureate in 1970 and later a doctoral degree in sociology in 1988 from the London School of Economics, after which she joined the LSE sociology faculty. She spent the next 15 years teaching in that department and retired in 2003. She published this article in 1995 after first presenting it as her presidential address to the 1993 annual convention of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. The article bears the hallmarks that have made her a controversial figure in the field. While she is not a follower or a proponent of any of the new religious movements or cults that she has studied, she also has avoided taking an anti-cult position and attempts to find an objective middle ground for her research. This has led to criticism from people who campaign to rescue people from cults and deprogram them, who wish that she would take sides with them against such cults.
Eileen Barker begins her article with a quote from a late 20th century religious cult leader who came from India to the United States and established a following of devoted believers. Somebody asked him what he thought of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Barker writes, "There was a very long pause. Then the guru raised an eyebrow ever so slightly. 'In my whole life,' he said, 'I don't think I've ever heard of anything so ridiculous.'" That quote from the Bhagwan sets the stage perfectly for the theme of Barker's presidential address to that same Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in 1993. Is scientific study of religion just a joke, or can we really learn something important from such an effort? Obviously, she feels we can. But social scientists setting out towards such a goal are not like physical scientists who push their pioneering research into new realms of reality such as quantum physics that never have been imagined before. Such research in the physical sciences has been compared to explorers arriving in a new, unknown, and uninhabited continent. The explorers are filling in a blank map with new knowledge gained from their research. In contrast, social scientists have been compared to the residents of an already inhabited country, looking around at what is already a familiar landscape and trying to see it in some kind of new light. When these social scientists try to present such a new perspective on the world around them, they find themselves surrounded by existing interpretations of that reality, interpretations based on traditional views handed down from the past. Sociologists attempting a scientific study of religion, for example, find themselves faced with what Barker called a marketplace of reality construction, already filled with competing groups, each trying to describe personal religious experiences, religious doctrines, and religious social organization from their own points of view. When it comes to religion in particular, this idea of a marketplace of ideas is a quintessentially American idea, even though Barker is from England. The extent of such a marketplace of religious thought has varied tremendously across time and place. During the Spanish Inquisition, for example, the Roman Catholic Church did its best to eliminate every vendor in that marketplace except themselves, using any means necessary to drive out unorthodox beliefs and behavior. The marketplace of religious reality construction probably reaches its widest extent in a place like the contemporary United States, where all forms of religion are thrown together into the common pool of society, where they must each sink or swim on their own abilities to attract believers. The ideal of market competition has been extended to religious life, as well as to selling tires or breakfast cereal or life insurance. This flourishing marketplace of ideas about religion brings up a fundamental question for Barker. If there's already a whole spectrum of competing perspectives on organized religion out there, from true believers to scornful atheists, what benefit is there in attempting some kind of scientific study of the subject? This is exactly the same problem that sociologists always encounter. Kingsley Davis once observed that anyone who says that we ought to deliberately try to change anything about the institution of the family is usually regarded as either wicked or a fool. Economists have managed to carve out a fairly respectable platform from which to attempt scientific management of the marketplace for buying and selling goods and services. But extending this idea of scientific study to our religious beliefs often goes well beyond what most people find desirable, or maybe even possible at all. Social science faces a unique problem because human goals and values serve as signposts guiding the application of all the other sciences, whether we control chemicals, electricity, crop seeds, metals, or any other aspect of the natural world for our own benefit. But in the social sciences, those goals and values become the actual subjects of the scientific research. What's left at that point to serve as the signposts? The typical answer, even among social scientists themselves, is to treat some aspect of their subject matter as off-limits, to preserve some kind of absolute values that can't be questioned or changed. And since such absolute values often come from religion, the social scientific study of religion in particular can become quite confused and problematic. This becomes clear in Barker's article. To try to clarify and organize this complex question, Barker distinguishes between two sources of information about religion. The first or primary source for finding out what religion is about comes from the people who are actually having the personal religious experiences themselves, who are participating in the religion as members and believers. When people join together and interact as members of a religion, they experience one level of social reality. The other kind of information about religion involves what she calls secondary constructions. This is what people say or think about a religion in situations outside the primary or internal participation of religious members with each other, outside such personal religious experiences. Her choice of the word secondary could also be translated as second-hand information about the religion. In such secondary constructions of religion, one very important aspect can no longer be included. By definition, such constructions do not include the actual personal religious experiences shared by believers when they are engaged in their primary construction of the religion. We can't study those actual personal experiences. We can only study what people say and do about them outside of the experiences themselves. So the sociology of religion is not in the business of describing, measuring, or evaluating those personal experiences. This agnostic attitude about the primary activities themselves is what has gotten Barker into trouble with other groups in the marketplace of reality construction. But after sketching this important distinction between primary and secondary constructions of religion, she actually has to backtrack a little in the article. She has to admit that the line between these two can be blurred in some ways. For example, even in the middle of the most intense personal religious interactions, during a prayer meeting or a ritual dance around a roaring fire or an outbreak of speaking in tongues, even the most devout believer cannot remain completely subjectively immersed in the sensations of the moment. There will be a flickering back and forth between simply feeling the sensations of the experience flooding in from the outside and an awareness of one's own individual consciousness, the position of the observer looking out from an individual personality on the experience out there around you. And at those moments of self-awareness, the individual inevitably will have to make conscious decisions about how to behave, what Irving Goffman called the presentation of self in everyday life. These conscious acts of self-expression must be recognized, according to the distinction set out by Barker, as secondary constructions. One presents oneself to others in the situation in a deliberate, conscious way. Although such choices about personal actions may reflect some kind of transcendent religious sensations, they are not the religious experience itself. They are a response to it, and therefore secondary constructions. In the same way, purely secondary constructions of religion also can become primary constructions. When people enter into a social setting where personal religious experiences may occur, they might be present simply to observe or study what other people are experiencing. They may not be believers at all themselves, but their presence becomes part of the setting and therefore can influence the experiences of everyone else. This is the classic problem faced by all first-person social research, the problem of reactivity to the researcher from the social group being studied. My all-time favorite parody of this reactivity problem comes from Gary Larson's famous Far Side cartoon, showing a group of villagers frantically hiding all of their modern conveniences like lamps, televisions, telephones, and the like. One of them is looking back from the window, crying out the warning, "Anthropologists! Anthropologists!" The two anthropologists coming up the path in their pith helmets will drastically change the social reality they encounter inside the hut simply by stepping through the door. Despite her recognition of the blurry boundary between primary and secondary constructions of reality, though, and despite her admissions that reactivity can be a problem and that there are some aspects of religious experience that we simply can't study in any reliably scientific way, Barker still insists that social science research into organized religion is not only possible, but desirable. We will see how she justifies this optimistic attitude. Once she has sorted out the difference between primary and secondary constructions of religion, Barker gets down to the real business of her presidential address. She takes us on a little tour of the marketplace of reality construction so we can visit some of the different groups that she has encountered or created herself during her research into what are often called new religious movements. These movements include a wide range of different kinds of groups that advocate a bewildering variety of religious doctrines and practices. Barker got started in this area of study once she had finished her doctoral degree in London by doing first-person participant observation research in the Unification Church in the UK. She got to know people who belonged to this group, went to their meetings and other activities, and talked to them person to person about what they were doing, what they believed, and how the Unification Church worked as an organized group. She also collected all kinds of information put out by the Unification Church, its official secondary constructions of reality, meant for public consumption. So the first booth that we will visit in the marketplace of reality construction is a booth set up by this religious group. The Reverend Sun Myung Moon occupies the top spot in the Unification Church in a way similar to the position of the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. This is because Reverend Moon invented the Unification Church in South Korea right after the Second World War. He grew up in the Korean Presbyterian Church established by Western missionaries in his country, but soon after puberty, during late adolescence, he began to make some unusual religious claims. Moon declared that he had learned in a vision that he was in fact a new incarnation of the Savior, a new successor to Jesus Christ. Although Christ had come to us in human form and died on the cross to save our souls, Moon announced that his own mission was to save our physical bodies too, not just our souls. He claimed that because his own body contained the divine essence of God, he could transmit this divine essence to other people through sexual intercourse. Once their bodies had been saved by having sex with him, they could pass on the salvation to others. Unsurprisingly, this unusual claim got him kicked out of the Korean Presbyterian Church. He disappeared from the religious landscape for a few years. When he reappeared later, he apparently had learned his lesson. The sexual transmission of physical salvation had disappeared from his preaching. We now hear about the divine principle instead of his divine essence. This principle is a syncretistic combination of Orthodox Christian doctrines, Buddhist philosophy, principles borrowed from behaviorist psychology, and other sources. It consists of a complex web of abstractions. However, Reverend Moon remains the sole absolute authority about what this principle means and how it translates into recipes for living. He and his wife present themselves to the world, as well as to believers in his church, who are often referred to as Moonies, as divine examples of the unification principle. Thanks to effective organization and advertising, the Unification Church has grown rapidly and expanded all around the world. One of their most effective publicity activities takes the form of regular international conferences, to which the church invites scholars of religion from many universities, paying their travel expenses and subsidizing their participation in these meetings. Barker herself attended several of these conferences as part of her research into the group and received plenty of financial support from the church for her efforts. I encountered the Moonies myself when I was in graduate school. The group focuses recruiting in particular on college campuses. Every Friday there was a bus parked near Sproul Plaza on the Berkeley campus, and Moonies walked around inviting other students to come and spend a weekend in the countryside with them. If you got on the bus, I never did, you rode up to the Mooney Retreat near Boonville in California, a ranch setting where the latest techniques of mind control were applied to you scientifically. You were never alone. A member always accompanied you, always smiling the Dale Carnegie smile because a former Dale Carnegie executive had become the North American head of the church, telling you what a great person you are and sympathizing with all your problems, pointing out how the church offered an answer to every one of them. Your diet for the weekend was all carbs and no protein, a lot of peanut butter sandwiches. Late nights and early mornings made for very little sleep. By the time you got back on Monday morning, your new friends had done their very best to bring you into the group. But Barker is not a Mooney. She also takes us to visit another very different booth in the marketplace of reality construction. When young people in particular have run off from their parents and sometimes from their jobs and other friends to join the Unification Church, lots of these former friends and family have not just watched them go. At first, in an individual case-by-case fashion, people began to try to get these young adults back, to get them to leave the church and come home again. This reaction was particularly strong because, like any good religious cult, the Moonies preached that everybody outside the group was a dangerous enemy, even your parents, your girlfriend or boyfriend, your roommate. None of them had the real answers to life, so you had to cut yourself off from them to avoid the dangers of contamination and backsliding. This upset members' families so much that eventually they began to band together into organizations devoted to rescuing their former friends and relatives. Barker puts all these rescue and deprogramming groups into the booth called anti-religious movements in the marketplace of reality construction. She's also enough of a sociologist to know that if social scientists are going to participate in this marketplace of reality construction, they can't just operate as isolated individuals any more than could the rescue groups. So she actually incorporated a group of her own called Inform, with the express purpose not of promoting or debunking a group like the Unification Church, but simply to study it as objectively and scientifically as possible. In place of divine principles, she pursued the principle of supporting general statements with empirical evidence. In place of moral judgments that the Moonies were cynical, evil opportunists preying on vulnerable young adults, she pursued efforts to understand how Mooney members and leaders saw themselves, as well as trying to understand the positions and feelings of people in the rescue groups. It is an uneasy balancing act to try to set up such an observation post in the midst of the swirling controversies and conflicts at the heart of social life. And Barker's life in Inform has been a constant struggle to try to keep her own balance and to be as objective as she can in her work. To round out her tour of the marketplace of reality construction, she also takes us to visit briefly at some other booths where other organized groups in society have engaged with the issue of new religious movements like the Moonies. The two main such groups that we visit are the news media on one hand, and the professionals like doctors, marriage counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and other therapists on the other. After we finish our tour of the marketplace, Barker then gives us a little summary of how all these different booths or groups have decided to construct the reality of religion in the case of the Unification Church. After giving us her little tour of the marketplace of reality construction for the new religious movement she studied, Barker compares and contrasts the different positions taken by each group in the booths we visited. This comparison is particularly helpful for us because it allows us to get a clearer perspective on what it might mean to take the position of a social scientist, someone trying to develop a sociology of religion. Although this issue of where we stand may already have occurred to you, those of us living inside the engine of social science and actively pursuing our own personal research strategies can sometimes lose track of this question. What is the place of the sociologist in society? This question actually has generated a huge ongoing debate within the social sciences. We can't do justice to the whole debate here, let alone resolve it with one obviously superior solution, but at least we can call attention to it. Barker starts with the two main adversaries in the social arena, the new religious movement itself, in her case the Moonies, and the anti-cult movement that emerged in response to it, the deprogrammers and rescue groups. These two sides of the social coin provide us with clear, diametrically opposed contrasts in almost every way. The purpose of the religious group is to promote itself, to attract believers and grow. To do this, the group's secondary construction of reality emphasizes the spiritual claims that this religion has made contact with the realm of the sacred, that it has obtained insights into good versus evil in the world, and that it can tell us how we should use these insights to live good lives, be happy, and make the world a better place. This promotional message excludes any kind of information that would put the group in a negative light, such as cases of group members who do not achieve happiness from following the group's teaching, but become more unhappy instead. The message never questions the divinity of Reverend Moon or allows any criticism of him or other leaders. On the other side of this social coin, the anti-cult movement arises out of a clear purpose to take away the religious group's members, and in extreme cases to destroy the group itself, discrediting its leaders or possibly even locking them up in prison. To do this, the anti-cult activists emphasize all the negative stories that can be identified about the group. This might include stories about abandoned friendships, careers, families, partners, perhaps even children, and the griefs caused when a recruit cuts off all ties with a former life. It might include accounts given by unhappy former members who have left the group, telling of the psychological pressures they experienced to conform to the group's teaching, and possibly even threats and other forms of manipulation to prevent the person from leaving. These anti-cult activists are just as selective in the evidence they choose to highlight or to ignore as are the promoters of the religious group. They do not want to hear about any cases in which someone joins the group and really does become a much happier person. They call a lot of attention to the lavish estates and lifestyle of Reverend Moon and his relatives, who have become extremely rich out of their new religion. But they get angry at Eileen Barker and accuse her of selling out to the Moonies when she reports both sides of the story regarding consequences of joining the Unification Church. This brings us to Barker's Inform group and her attempt to live and work in her social science observation post rather than joining either side of the controversy surrounding this new religious movement. She has no desire to promote the group and help it recruit new members, and she makes no judgment about whether Reverend Moon is in fact actually a new Messiah or an audacious fraud. But she also has no urge to destroy it or grab its members off the street and deprogram them with the same kind of mind control techniques they accuse the group of using. Eileen Barker just wants to gather all the information she can about everybody involved. To do this, she must find empirical evidence not only of the secondary constructions, the doctrines and stories offered by each side, but she must actually observe both sides of the conflict, record behavior patterns and outcomes, and report facts as she can find them. For example, her observations show a consistently high rate of turnover in the Unification Church. Although many people get on the bus and are recruited into the group, a large stream of people also continuously abandons the group, disillusioned and unsatisfied with Mooney doctrines and how these rules affect their own lives. This high turnover is not good news for either side, so neither side is happy with her for documenting it. For the Unification Church, it means that the group is not nearly as successful and widespread as you might think only from the recruiting numbers of people who initially become Moonies, because so many of them subsequently bail out and leave again. For the anti-cult activists, it means that all of their urgency and energy to pull members out of the group might amount to running along beside a wagon that is already rolling downhill, that people might get tired of the Unification Church and leave on their own accord, even without such anti-cult efforts. Finally, Barker shows us that this conflict between the religious group and its opponents inevitably draws in other institutional players in society as well. There are all kinds of occupational groups that give meaning to their members' lives through the belief that other people need their help. The legal profession helps people not by providing contact with the sacred, where we can distinguish between good and evil, but by providing contact with the law, where we can distinguish between criminal and legitimate behavior. Like the social scientists, legal professionals demand empirical evidence in the form of witness testimony and other facts that can be established. Like the social scientists, they are not out to promote or destroy either of the original opposing groups. The first main difference between the lawyers and the social scientists is that each group demands different forms of evidence. The second main difference is that the social scientists do not have access to institutionalized mechanisms that can get you thrown in jail or fined if the investigation turns out in certain ways. The other booth in the marketplace, the therapists, usually can't put you in jail based on their conclusions any more than the social scientists can. Although there may be cases where a psychiatrist could have somebody confined in an institution for certain kinds of behavior. This group, at least in American society, follows a highly individualized client-professional model in which their purpose is to help one particular person, their client, in some sense. They don't work for any group, only for the client. Their claim to professional knowledge means that they get to play a major role in defining what the desired outcome for that client should be. In this case, the ultimate reference point guiding their therapy does not come from a sacred perspective defining good versus evil. It does not come from a legal perspective defining criminal versus legitimate behavior either. Behavior and attitudes can be perfectly legal, but still constitute problems for the therapist to solve, because the therapist is concerned with yet another axis of duality in society, healthy versus unhealthy, and of course the therapists get to define what healthy means. So everybody has an axe to grind, not only in a new religious movement like the Unification Church, but in every aspect of social life from your job to your family. Barker openly admits that just like all these other booths, the social scientist in the observation post also lives inside the society being studied. A commitment to scientific discipline, to identification of facts, and an attempt to observe all sides of any social situation also amounts in the final analysis to yet another side that one can take. For the Mooney, the source of ultimate values guiding actions in life comes from Reverend Moon directly. For the anti-cult activist, these ultimate values may be rooted in family or other personal relationships that should be restored. For the lawyer, the ultimate value is the law. For the therapist, this value is some definition of health. For the social scientist, the ultimate value might be described as a kind of religion in its own right, a belief that by aspiring to be as objective as possible and to generate as clear and complete an account of reality as possible, somehow the world will be better for your efforts. The social scientist also has ultimate values and a purpose. This is a good thing to remember when you read any study of religion, not just Barker's article.